June 1944. Operation Bagration. History knows of many heroic tank duels, but historians prefer to call what happened that day by a nameless swamp an engineering dismantling. An ISU-152 against an entire German column. Chances of survival? None. The Soviet crew had a choice: die heroically in a shootout, or do something that would forever alter the landscape of the area. The commander chose the latter. He ordered the gunner not to aim at the tanks, but at an old concrete sluice. Why waste a precious shell on a chunk of wall when the enemy is advancing? The answer to that question conceals a terrifying cunning. You will see how 5 shells can destroy more enemies than an entire artillery regiment, and why the surviving Germans envied the dead. It was the dirtiest and most brilliant trap of the war. 1944, June, Belarus. This was a time and place where geography ceased to be mere landscape and became an active participant in the war. Operation Bagration unfolded not as a heroic epic, but as a giant industrial mechanism for grinding down matter. Army Group Center wasn't just retreating, they were being squeezed out by the press of Soviet artillery and tank wedges. But here, in the lowlands, by the nameless swamp, the scale of the offensive didn't matter. A different physics was at work here. Local. Dead end. A heavy self-propelled artillery gun, the ISU-152, froze in the thick brush like a prehistoric predator caught in a tar pit. The crew didn't call it a tank. A tank forgives mistakes. A tank has a turret and the right to maneuver. This machine was a self-propelled mount for an ML-20S howitzer gun. 46 tons of alloy steel created with one purpose: to deliver kinetic energy to where concrete and armor consider themselves invulnerable. Soldiers called it the Beast Slayer. Engineers called it a tool for dismantling fortifications. But right now, this tool was powered down. The fuel gauge needle lay dead against the stop. In the tanks, there were only diesel fumes and sediment. The engine, a 12-cylinder V2IS diesel, was silent. Without fuel, the ton-heavy heart of the machine turns into a useless lump of cast iron. We were stationary. The tracks had sunk 15 centimeters into the viscous soil. The swamp surrounding us breathed dampness and rot. The topography of this area was an ally only to those who knew how to read a map not as a drawing, but as a drainage scheme. Commander Smirnov knew how. He had been a civil engineer in that past life where foundations were poured with concrete, not blood. Now he looked at the map, and his brain automatically translated the symbols into coefficients of trafficability. We were cut off. The radio was choking on static crackle. The airwaves were as empty as our tanks. Around us was only a gray, dense fog, looking like wet cotton wool. It dampened sounds and distorted distances. Visibility was less than 50 meters. This fog was our only cover and our prison. If German aviation took to the sky, we would become simply a stationary target against a background of green mud. But the sky was low, leaden, pressing down on the hatches. Inside the fighting compartment, it smelled of heated metal, gun oil, and unwashed bodies. The tightness here was a design feature. Every cubic centimeter of space had been stolen from the crew in favor of the mechanisms. The breech of the gun occupied half the casemate. This was the altar we served. I looked at the ammo rack. A void gaped within it. Of the 20 rounds required by regulation, 5 remained. 5 separate loading arguments. 3 high-explosive shells, Model 530F540, and 2 concrete piercing. These weren't just numbers. Each shell weighed 48 kilograms. 48 kilograms of death, packaged in steel and explosives. The loader, Sergeant Ryabov, sat with his back against the hull. He was 22 years old, but his spine already knew what it was to lift a bag of cement every 20 seconds of combat. Now his hands rested on his knees, but the muscles of his forearms trembled slightly. This wasn't fear. It was the physiological memory of muscles awaiting a new load. The phantom weight of a shell not yet fed into the breach. War is not an attack at full height. War is logistics and scarcity. We had a shortage of everything except tension. Fear in such a box transforms. It ceases to be an emotion and becomes a bodily function. Elevated pulse to cycle oxygen faster. Dilated pupils to catch the slightest movement in the periscope. Cold sweat, the cooling system of an overheated nerve cluster. No one was hysterical. Hysteria burns calories, and we needed to conserve strength. The driver-mechanic Petrov wiped the control levers with a rag. It was a meaningless action. The levers were clean, but it was soothing. His fingers, ingrained with grease, moved rhythmically. He was checking the oil pressure in the system, even though the engine wasn't running. It was a ritual of checking life support. As long as the instrument needles exist, the machine is alive. The ISU-152 is a complex organism. If you don't respect its mechanics, it will kill you sooner than the enemy. Powder gases after a shot accumulate in the casemate, eating away eyes and lungs if the fan can't cope. Recoil of 152 tons of force shakes the hull so hard that an unprepared man can bleed from the ears. We were prepared. Our eardrums had long since hardened from the roar, and our lungs were used to the bitter taste of burnt gunpowder. Smirnov looked up from the map. His face, etched with deep shadows from the dim dome light, was impenetrable. He wasn't a poster hero. He was a foreman at a site that had to be either commissioned or destroyed. There was no patriotic fire in his eyes, only the cold calculation of trajectories and angles. He knew. We were sitting in an ambush with an empty tank and 5 shells against the unknown. The only way through the swamp was an old corduroy road, a log causeway laid down before the war, a flimsy road capable of supporting a cart, but not a tank column. Or was it capable? Smirnov was evaluating the bearing capacity of the soil. Outside, beyond the armor, the world seemed extinct. But it was a false silence. The earth under the tracks vibrated barely perceptibly. It wasn't shivering from the cold. Somewhere out there, behind the veil of fog, thousands of engines were working. Operation Bagration was driving the Wehrmacht west, and part of that steel avalanche could spill out right here, on our corduroy road, on our 5 shells. The caliber of 152 millimeters is Stalin's sledgehammer. It doesn't fire warning shots. It leaves no wounded. When a high-explosive shell hits a medium tank, the turret is torn from the ring by kinetic shock, even if the fuse doesn't trigger. We knew the power of our weapon, but we also knew its weakness, a rate of fire of 2 rounds per minute, at best. If Ryabov didn't tear his back, if the breech block didn't jam, if the gunner didn't miss, we had no right to miss. Each shell was worth its weight in gold, worth the lives of the entire crew. Smirnov signaled to silence everything that could make a sound. We turned into hearing itself. We became part of the metal cooling in the damp air. In this silence, every creak of a leather belt seemed deafening. Seconds dripped thickly, like transmission oil in the frost. We waited. Not for the enemy. We waited for the solution to a problem whose conditions were not yet fully known. The fog outside began to change density. It was no longer static. It swirled, driven by currents of warm air. Something large and hot was moving through it. The ISU-152 stood motionless, camouflaged with branches and mud, blending into the swamp. We were not soldiers. We were the trigger in a trap mechanism that was about to snap shut. But was the spring strong enough? The water in a shell crater next to the track rippled. Smirnov pressed against the panoramic sight. His fingers rested on the traverse handwheels but didn't grip them. Too early. Physics teaches patience. Potential energy must accumulate to a critical mass before turning into kinetic energy. We were that energy, compressed in a steel box in the middle of the Belarusian swamps. 5 shells, 0 liters of fuel, and an eternity until the first shot. The fog didn't just hide the horizon, it changed the laws of perception. Sight here in the lowlands became a vestige.
Eyes sought support in the milky whiteness, but found only emptiness.
Hearing, however, sharpened to the limit, compensating for the blindness. The moist, dense air of the swamp worked as a perfect conductor, an acoustic lens amplifying every rustle. At first, it was like infrasonic vibration. It wasn't heard with the ears, it was felt with the diaphragm. A low, heavy hum that made teeth ache. We sat inside a steel resonator. The hull of the ISU-152, half submerged in the ground, worked like the diaphragm of a giant stethoscope pressed to the chest of a sick Earth. The Earth transmitted the diagnosis. Death was approaching us. Heavy, mechanized death. "Engines!" The voice of the mechanic Petrov sounded like grinding metal. He didn't turn his head. The back of his neck was pressed into the armored backrest of his seat. "Gasoline! High RPM! Not ours!" I listened closely. Through the monotonous rushing of blood in my ears, a rhythm began to emerge.
It wasn't the even bass purr of Soviet V2 diesels. The sound was sharper, ragged, with the characteristic metallic clicking of valves. Maybach, 12-cylinder carburetted monsters, the heart of German tank building. The sound grew, layering upon itself, turning into a solid wall of drone. This wasn't reconnaissance. Reconnaissance creeps. These men walked like owners, breaking out of a cauldron, believing in their invulnerability and the thickness of their armor. The vibration intensified. Now it could be seen. The speedometer needle, long frozen at 0, trembled finely. Dust accumulated in the seams between the armor plates flowed down in thin streams. A can of grease, forgotten on the floor, slowly crawled toward the engine bulkhead. "Tracks," whispered the gunner, not tearing himself away from the sight. "Wide ones. Characteristic grinding. Interleaved suspension." He was right. The characteristic clatter of tracks grinding the wood of the causeway was unmistakable. German equipment sounded like a rock crusher. The sound of metal rubbing against metal, the squeal of unmaintained rollers, the moan of overloaded transmissions. The column was moving heavily. They were dragging tons of loot, remaining ammunition, the fear of encirclement, and the hope of a breakthrough. Smirnov sat motionless, his head tilted to the side. He was counting. In this chaos of sounds, he isolated individual vehicles, trying to build a movement schematic in his head. "Lead vehicle is heavy," the commander said curtly. "Behind it, another one. Interval 30 meters. Then trucks. Many." This was the mathematics of catastrophe. If we let the lead vehicles pass, the column would pull onto the causeway. Hundreds of soldiers, dozens of pieces of equipment. If they passed here, through this godforsaken swamp, they would come out in the rear of our advancing division.
right where field hospitals and depots were currently deploying, where no one expected the strike of a tank fist. Smirnov understood. We weren't just sitting in ambush. We were the only safety valve on this main line. If the valve didn't work, the pressure would burst the front from the inside. "Range 400, Petrov spoke with just his lips, reading the vibration of the levers. "Coming along the corduroy road." It became hot inside the casemate. It wasn't thermal heat, but psychosomatic. Adrenaline pumped into the blood, demanding action. Hands itched to traverse the gun, catch the sound in the crosshairs, and pull the trigger. But engineering warfare does not tolerate hysteria. Shooting at sound in the fog means giving away your position and dying ingloriously without inflicting damage. We had 5 shells, 5 chances to change the geometry of the battle. Wasting them on noise would be a crime against physics. The drone became tangible. It seemed the air inside the self-propelled gun thickened. Heavy German Tiger or Panther tanks, by sound you couldn't tell, both growl like beasts, were approaching an invisible line. We heard the logs of the road cracking under their weight. 60 tons of German steel were pressing centuries-old trunks into the swamp slime. This crunch of wood was more terrifying than gunshots. It signified inevitability. "Loader, check." Smirnov's voice was dry as an autumn leaf. "HE in the tray. Fuse set to high explosive. Cap removed," Ryabov responded. His voice didn't tremble, but I saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped the guardrail. We were blind, but we knew the enemy's anatomy. We heard the driver of the lead tank shifting gears, dropping revs before a difficult section. We heard the strained howl of cooling fans. We were so close that it seemed if one opened the hatch, one could spit on their armor. But we were welded into our box. The isolation was total. The external world ceased to exist as a visual image. It turned into an acoustic nightmare. Clatter, roar, crunch. The sound wave pressed on eardrums, trying to break our will. One wanted to scream to drown out this mechanical gnashing, but the crew was silent. This was the silence of professionals who know. Sound is just air vibrations. The threat is real, but panic kills faster than a shell. Smirnov raised his hand, calling for absolute attention. The noise of the motors changed tonality. They were coming out onto the straight section before the sluice. The fog began to thin, torn by streams of hot exhaust. The sound picture became as clear as a blueprint. Here is the lead. Here is the second. Here is the tail of the column, fading into the swamp. We heard their breathing. Now it remained to see their flesh. The moment when sound turns into an image is always shocking. You hear the machine, draw it in your imagination, but reality is always coarser. The clanking of tracks turned into physical pain. It felt like they were driving right over our roof. The earth under the ISU was shaking. It was an earthquake of local scale caused by the migration of steel. We were a small point of resistance in an ocean of noise, and this ocean was preparing to swallow us. But we had a breakwater. 152 millimeters of argument, ready to outshout any Maybach. Smirnov didn't look at the enemy like a soldier. A soldier sees a target, the cross on the armor, the muzzle brake, the vision slit. Smirnov looked like a demolition engineer. Before him was not a tank company, but a physics problem with boundary conditions that made a standard solution impossible. 5 shells. This is an axiom that cannot be circumvented. A direct duel with the lead Tiger is an equation whose result equals 0. Suppose we burn the leader. 152 millimeters will blow his transmission into scrap metal. What next? A disabled carcass weighing 57 tons will become an excellent breastwork for those coming behind.
They'll simply push the burning wreck into the swamp and continue moving. And we'll be left with 4 shells against an entire division. This isn't a battle. It's agony, with the execution of the sentence delayed by 3 minutes. The commander tore himself away from the eyepiece. The cramped casemate smelled of tension, a mixture of sweat and electricity. Smirnov's brain worked in afterburner mode, discarding emotions as excess ballast. Fear of death interferes with calculations. He switched his attention from the German column to the landscape. The map of the terrain in his head overlaid the reality visible through the periscope. To the left, impassable quagmire. To the right, a lake, the water level of which was raised by autumn rains and the spring flood that never receded. Between them, a thin thread of the corduroy road and an old concrete sluice of the reclamation system, built back in the 30s. This sluice was the key. Smirnov knew such structures, a standard Soviet design. Reinforced concrete, strength class, medium, designed service life without major overhaul, 10 years. It had been standing for 15. The water in the lake pressed on the gates with a force of thousands of tons. Hydrostatic pressure sought an exit, bursting the concrete piers, seeping into micro cracks, eating away the rebar with rust. The dam was a loaded weapon. It only lacked a trigger. "Range to lead, 350. Gunner Volkov's voice trembled with excitement. "I see the side. He's exposed. Perfect angle. Commander, permission to fire." Volkov was a good gunner. He saw the vulnerability of the armor. He knew that the side projection of a Tiger is only 80 millimeters of vertical steel. Our shell would punch through it, tearing out the engine along with the bulkhead. It was the temptation of a simple solution. Kill the enemy in front of you. Hunter's instinct. But engineering intelligence works differently. It seeks not the vulnerability of the target, but the vulnerability of the system. "Belay the tank," Smirnov's voice sounded like a hammer blow on an anvil. Hard, dry, peremptory. "But Commander, he'll get away!" Volkov almost screamed, his hands convulsively gripping the traverse wheels. "We have a 100% kill. I said belay." Smirnov jerked the map open, poking a finger at a point marked with a blue circle. "Your target is not the tank. Your target is the concrete. Do you see the sluice?" Silence hung in the casemate, heavy as a tombstone. The crew was digesting the order. Shoot at concrete when a fat, arrogant tiger is in the sights? It seemed like madness, a violation of all regulations and instincts of self-preservation. But Smirnov saw what they didn't. He saw force vectors. A tank is a local point. A dam is a source of energy. "The sluice," Smirnov repeated, emphasizing every word. "Right pier. Support strut of the lifting mechanism. Range 200. Water level critical. If we knock out the support, physics will do the rest." He quickly estimated the compressive strength of the concrete in his mind. Grade 200, no more. The shell 530F540 carries nearly 6 kilograms of explosive substance. But the main thing isn't the TNT. The main thing is the kinetic energy of a slug weighing 48 kilograms, flying at a speed of 600 meters per second. Upon impact with a rigid barrier, this energy turns into heat and the destruction of the material's crystal lattice. Concrete is not plastic. It doesn't flow like metal. It shatters. The shock wave will travel along the rebar, crumbling the binding agent. Vibration will finish off the old seams. "Volkov, listen to the task." Smirnov spoke quickly but without fuss. "We don't need to punch through the wall. We need to create resonance. Impact in the lower third of the support, where the material stress is maximum." "Understand?" The gunner slowly pulled away from the sight, looked at the commander with wild, uncomprehending eyes, and then pressed against the eyepiece again. He began to turn the traverse handwheel. The Tiger's turret drifted to the left. A gray, moss-covered concrete pillar, half hidden by fog, crawled into the crosshairs. "I see the target," Volkov responded dully. "Reference point is the crack at the waterline." "Accepted. Loader, check the ramming." "This must be one shot. The dam won't give us a second, and the Germans won't give it to us." The logic of the battle had flipped. Now we weren't hunting. We were conducting engineering sabotage. We were going to use gravity and the mass of water as allies. It was a calculation on a cascading effect.
The destruction of one structural element would lead to an avalanche-like collapse of the entire system. The lake hanging over the road was millions of joules of potential energy. Smirnov intended to convert them into the kinetic energy of a flow. It was a risk beyond the pale. What if the shell ricochets off the slanted surface of the pier? What if the concrete turns out to be stronger and we just leave a chip on it? Then the Tigers will turn their turrets and turn us into a colander. We will expose our flank to an 88mm strike, ignoring a direct threat for the sake of a hypothetical catastrophe. But an engineer knows, risk is simply probability multiplied by consequences. The probability of piercing the Tiger's front and stopping the column with 5 shells is 0.0. The probability of washing them all away with one blow is 50-50. Mathematics was on the side of madness. Smirnov felt the floor vibrating under his feet. German equipment was approaching the point of no return. They were pulling onto the causeway, confident in their invulnerability. They weren't looking at the dam. For them, it was just an element of the landscape, a piece of old Soviet concrete. They didn't know strength of materials. They didn't know that this concrete was groaning under load. "Adjust 05, Smirnov corrected. "Hit the joint. Right where the rebar is rusty. Let the impact energy go inside the structure." Volkov breathed heavily, wheezing. His hands, used to tracking moving targets, now had to work with surgical precision on a static object. This is harder. Motion forgives errors. Stasis demands the absolute. The crosshairs froze on the grey, wet surface of the concrete. We were refusing the duel. We were refusing a heroic death in a shootout. We were choosing the role of an operator of the elements. This was the highest form of war. War of the mind against brute force. Intellect against armor thickness. Smirnov mentally traced the trajectory. From the muzzle of the howitzer to the point of contact, the arc of death. In this parabola was his whole life, all the experience of construction and destruction. Time compressed into a dot. The external world ceased to exist. There was no fog, no Germans, no war. There was only a force vector that had to be applied to the single correct point in space. Archimedes asked for a fulcrum to move the Earth. Smirnov needed an impact point to drown a legion. And he found it. Visibility dropped to 0. The fog, disturbed by the exhaust of the German column, thickened, turning into a dirty, opaque mess. The sluice, which a minute ago was a vague gray blur, disappeared. The optics became useless. The TS-17 telescopic sight showed only a milky veil with the black markings of the scale. We were blind. In conditions of direct combat engagement, this is death. But we weren't entering combat. We were solving a geodesic problem. Smirnov closed his eyes. He didn't need to see the concrete to know where it was. Engineering memory stored a 3-dimensional model of the space. The road is a straight line. The sluice is a perpendicular. Convergence angle, 90 degrees. Distance,
200 meters. He visualized the map, overlaying it on a coordinate grid. Now he was working not as a self-propelled gun commander, but as an artillery computer. Trigonometry formulas scrolled through his head, cleansed of panic and doubt. "Volkov, we're working blind." Smirnov's voice was even, devoid of human intonation. It was the voice of a machine dictating input data. "Reference point, the water's edge you saw. Traverse left 005, elevation the same." Gunner Volkov gripped the traverse wheels. His palms were wet with cold, sticky sweat. The steel of the wheels slipped under his fingers. It was the agony of a professional, shooting where nothing is visible is unnatural. Instinct demanded to see the target, lock onto it, ensure the inevitability of the hit. But now his eyes were the commander's brain. Volkov took a deep breath, trying to calm the trembling in his hands. The fine motor skills of his fingers had to be flawless. One wrong movement of the wrist, and a barrel weighing tons would go half a degree to the side. At a distance of 200 meters, this would result in a deviation of 1.5 meters. The shell would go into the water or hit a massive, safe section of the wall. The ISU-152 is not a tank with a rotating turret. It is a casemate mount. The horizontal traverse angle of the gun is limited to 10 degrees. If the target goes outside this sector, the driver mechanic comes into play. This is rough, heavy work requiring jeweled precision. Turning a 46-ton behemoth in place, in a viscous swamp, by a fraction of a degree, this is the art of clutch control.
"Petrov, short left," Smirnov commanded. "Dead slow, don't jerk, like you're carrying crystal." The engine wasn't running, but the mechanic used the inertia of the track tension and microscopic shifts of the ground. The hull of the self-propelled gun shuddered, grinding metal against roots. We shifted a millimeter. That was enough. The howitzer barrel now looked at the calculated point of emptiness, right where the load-bearing pier of the dam was hiding in the fog. Inside the casemate, time flowed differently. Seconds stretched into minutes. Every sound outside hit the nerves. The Germans were close now. We heard not only the roar of engines but also voices, curt commands in a foreign language, laughter, coughing. Someone on the armor of a truck was playing a harmonica. This everyday detail, music in the middle of war, seemed monstrous. They felt safe. They didn't know that 100 meters away in the bushes, 5 people were calculating the trajectory of their demise. Volkov pressed his forehead against the brow pad of the sight. The rubber chilled his skin. The reticle floated in the eyepiece, chevrons and dashes. He tried to align them with the phantom image of the sluice that remained on his retina. "Vertical aim, normal," he whispered. "Horizontal. Commander, play in the mechanism. I'm afraid I'll smear it." Play in the traverse mechanism is the curse of old machines. Gears wear down, gaps appear. You turn the wheel, and the barrel stands still until the teeth engage. In that moment, you can over-rotate. Volkov took up the slack with the caution of a sapper diffusing a mine. He felt the resistance of the metal with his fingertips. A click. Another one. The barrel moved. Slowly, reluctantly, the heavy trunk of the howitzer crawled to the left, groping for the invisible vulnerability of the concrete. "Stop!" Smirnov froze. "Hold it!" Now everything depended on ballistics. The Shell 530F540 has a muzzle velocity of 600 meters per second. At such short range, the trajectory is practically flat. Corrections for wind, drift, air temperature, all this could be neglected. Only one variable remained: the human factor. Would the hand tremble at the moment of firing? We hung by a thread. If the shot didn't destroy the sluice, there would be no second chance. The Germans would see the muzzle flash. Even in the fog, The flash from 6 kilograms of gunpowder would be as bright as the birth of a supernova. 5 seconds after a miss, the turrets of the Tigers would turn in our direction. 88 millimeters would punch through the front armor of the ISU like cardboard. We would burn alive without managing to open the hatches. We would become a mass grave in an iron coffin. Smirnov understood this better than anyone, but his face remained a mask. He checked the calculations for the third time. The angle of the shell meeting the concrete, the angle of elevation, probability of ricochet. A concrete-piercing shell would have been better, but it lay deep in the rack. Getting it out meant losing precious seconds and rattling metal. We'd have to work with HE. This meant we were relying not on penetration, but on hydrostatic shock and vibration. We had to break the dam's spine with the brute force of the explosion. "Loader, step away from the breach." "Recoil will smear you," the commander said quietly. Ryabov pressed himself against the side wall. The barrel recoil of the ML-20 is huge. Anyone in the operating zone of the breach block would turn into mincemeat. The tension reached its peak. It seemed the air in the casemate was electrified enough to ignite from a spark. We waited for the command. But Smirnov was silent. He was listening. He needed the column to pull in deeper, for the tail to crawl onto the corduroy road. For the trap to snap shut for everyone, not just the vanguard. Volkov held his finger on the trigger of the galvanic firing mechanism. His breathing was shallow, rapid. His heart pounded against his ribs so hard that it seemed the vibration was transmitting to the hull of the machine. "Just not now," he thought. "Just don't sneeze, don't blink, don't flinch." He became an extension of the gun, a living servo holding the crosshairs on a point that couldn't be seen. In this fog, in this silence broken only by the roar of enemy engines, the fate of not just a battle, but hundreds of people was being decided. One shell, 48 kilograms of steel and explosives, and infinite dark uncertainty ahead. We weren't aiming at concrete, we were aiming at probability, and that probability now weighed more than all our armor. The fog didn't tear apart immediately. It slid off in shreds, like rotten gauze, revealing a gray, wet reality. First, angles emerged, sharp, geometrically correct edges of armor plates, alien to nature. Then, muzzle brakes. Massive knobs on the ends of barrels, looking like hammerheads. And finally, the interleaved suspension of the road wheels. 2 Tigers floated out of the whitish mist. 57 tons of German technical genius each. They walked confidently, masterfully depressing the soil. Behind them trailed a plume of blue exhaust, mixing with the swamp steam. Inside the ISU-152, time stopped. The second hand in the head of every crew member froze, but pulses raced to the limit. This was the moment of truth, when the instinct of self-preservation screams, "Shoot or run," and discipline whispers, "Wait." Smirnov saw them through the periscope so close he could make out the weld seams on the turret of the lead tank. 88 millimeters of death looked straight ahead, swaying slightly on the unevenness of the corduroy road. The Tiger crew felt safe. The commander's cupola hatch was ajar. A head and a forage cap stuck out of it. The German was smoking. The ember of the cigarette seemed a beacon of arrogance. They didn't expect a heavy Soviet self-propelled gun here. They thought this swamp was dead. "Fire!" Volkov's rasp broke into a squeal. His hands on the hand wheels trembled. The crosshairs of the sight wandered over the side of the lead tank. It was a perfect target. Point-blank range. Impossible to miss. "Belay!" Smirnov didn't shout. He hissed, like compressed air escaping through a valve. "Hold formation. Let them pass." It was an order that broke the psyche. Let the enemy into the rear? Let him flank us? Smirnov wasn't thinking in platoon battle tactics, but in a strategy of destruction. If we strike now, we destroy 2 tanks. The rest, trucks, APCs, infantry, will scatter, back up, disappear into the fog, and return later with artillery and aviation. We needed not just to knock out a couple of machines, we needed to bury the whole column. Pull them all onto the narrow ribbon of the corduroy road like cattle to the slaughter. The fighting compartment smelled of sweat and adrenaline. Loader Ryabov stood bent under the weight of the shell. 48 kilograms of steel and explosives in his hands turned into a lead slab. He had been holding this weight for a minute already. The muscles of his forearms turned to stone, veins swelled like ropes. Lactic acid burned the fibers of his biceps. Every 10 seconds of holding such weight statically takes as much strength as a jerk of a barbell. Ryabov couldn't put the shell back in the tray. That meant extra noise and lost time firing. He couldn't load it into the breech without a command. He turned into a living bracket, balancing on the edge of physical failure. A drop of sweat broke from his nose and fell onto the breech block with a hiss. "Heavy, Comrade Commander." Ryabov exhaled through clenched teeth. His face turned crimson, eyes filled with blood. "Endure," Smirnov cut him off. "Endure, sons of bitches. Everyone, endure." Behind the Tigers appeared trucks, Opels and Mercedes covered with canvas. Under the tarps, silhouettes of soldiers could be guessed. Infantry. Lots of infantry. They sat relaxed, legs dangling. Someone was sleeping, leaning against the side. They rode along the corduroy road like it was an avenue. The wooden decking groaned and sagged under the wheels. Dirty water shot up in fountains from the cracks between the logs. Smirnov counted. 3rd truck. 4th. 5th. A half-track APC with an anti-aircraft mount. More trucks. The column was long. It pulled onto the section between the swamp and the sluice slowly, like a python. If we fired prematurely, the tail of the column would remain on solid ground. They would turn around and leave. We needed everyone, down to the last motorcyclist. The tension in the casemate reached a critical point. It seemed the air became viscous as jelly. The pounding of one's own heart in the ears drowned out the roar of German engines. It was torture by waiting. The gunner's hands turned white, digging into the hand wheels. He fought the desire to pull the trigger reflexively, just to relieve this monstrous pressure, to discharge the atmosphere with the roar of a shot. The psychology of a shooter demands action. Inaction in the sights kills the nervous system. The lead Tiger passed our sector of fire. It was 30 meters away. We saw the mud on its road wheels, saw the number on the turret, 312. Smirnov followed it with his eyes. Now, if we opened fire, this tank would be in our dead zone. We wouldn't be able to reach it with the gun. It would be too close and to the side. But Smirnov sacrificed safety for efficiency. He bet the crew's life against the total destruction of the enemy. "Commander, they'll spot us," whispered Petrov.
My hatch is vibrating. The vibration from heavy equipment transmitted through the ground to the hull of the ISU. It felt like we were being shaken in a giant sieve. A camouflage branch attached to the barrel treacherously shuddered and slid down. A German officer on an APC turned his head. His gaze slid over the bushes where we were hiding. He frowned, said something to the driver. A second stretched into eternity. Smirnov stopped breathing. If he noticed the glint of optics or the unnatural geometry of the bushes, the end. The turrets of the Tigers would start turning. We would have one shot at point-blank range, and then we would be executed. But the officer turned away. Fog and mud played for us. The human eye seeks movement, and we were dead. We were part of the landscape,
iron amidst wood and water. Ryabov behind me let out a quiet groan. His hands began to shake finely. The shell, weighing as much as a bag of cement, pulled him to the floor. He held death in his arms, and this death was becoming an unbearable burden. "Hold on, Ryabov," Smirnov hissed without turning around. 10 more seconds. Let them enter. Let them believe they survived. The column pulled completely onto the corduroy road. The last trailing truck with a field kitchen drove onto the logs. Now they were all here. On a narrow strip of wood sandwiched between the swamp and the lake, under the sights of gravity and our gun. The trap snapped shut. We had let the predators into the cage. Now it only remained to pull the lever. Iron discipline is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to subordinate fear to the physics of the process. Smirnov knew, a premature shot is emotion. A timely shot is calculation. He waited exactly as long as required for the center of mass of the column to be opposite the sluice, for the density of targets per square meter to reach a maximum. It became quiet in the casemate. Even the engines outside seemed like distant background noise. There was only heavy, stale air, and 5 people compressed into a spring. Ryabov shifted the shell to a more comfortable grip. Back muscles crunched. Volkov froze, staring into the cloudy eyepiece. Petrov placed his hands on the levers, ready to jerk. We held out. We didn't break. Now came the phase of active reaction. The energy accumulated by waiting had to spill out. 30 meters. That is pistol range. That is the distance at which armor ceases to be protection and becomes merely clothing for suicide bombers. The lead, Tiger, number 312, didn't just drive past. It invaded our intimate space, violating all laws of stealth. We felt the heat of its engine through the steel sides of our self-propelled gun. We heard the leather creak on its commander's seat as he shifted in the hatch. It was an elephant in a china shop, and we were the china. The giant machine, weighing 57 tons, stopped. The tracks bit into the corduroy road with a clang, squeezing black ooze from under the logs. The Maybach engine went to idle, trembling rhythmically. Why did he stop? Malfunction? Order? Or did he sense something? A predator's instinct sometimes works faster than radar. The German commander in the cupola, the one with the cigarette, stopped looking at the road. He slowly lowered his gaze down into the mud, right to where our 18-ton track had left a deep, jagged trace when entering the brush. We tried to camouflage the rut with branches, but the weight of the ISU-152 cannot be hidden completely. A deep indentation filled with water glistened treacherously. Fresh soil fracture. The trail led straight into the thicket where we held our breath. This was the moment when probability theory failed. The chance of him looking at exactly that point was 1 in a million. But war loves impossible events. The German took the cigarette out of his mouth. He leaned lower. His face, gray with dust, expressed not fear, but professional interest. He saw the anomaly. A trace that shouldn't be there. "Turret!" Petrov's strangled whisper sounded like a sentence. We heard the characteristic whining sound of the electric turret traverse drive. It's not a fast sound. It's a monotonous hum accompanied by the crunch of the ring. The Tiger's turret began to rotate. Slowly. Inevitably. The long 88mm barrel, previously facing forward, began to describe an arc in our direction. Smirnov watched through the periscope without blinking. He saw the muzzle brake growing in size. First it was in profile, then it began to turn en face. The black hole of the barrel was searching for us. It was the eye of a cyclops, and this eye was filled with death. At a distance of 30 meters, the German gunner doesn't even need to aim. He'll just press the firing pedal,
and the armor-piercing shell will punch through our front armor, transmission, gun breech, and engine, exiting through the rear. We won't even hear the shot. The speed of the shell is higher than the speed of sound. We will simply cease to exist. Paralysis set in inside the casemate. But it wasn't the paralysis of fear, but the paralysis of waiting. Loda Ryabov froze with the 48-kilogram shell in his hands, turning into a statue. If he drops it now, the clang will be heard in Berlin. Mechanic Petrov gripped the levers so hard it seemed the steel would bend. He was ready to jerk the machine back, but understood the futility of this gesture. The diesel was off. By the time he started the starter, by the time he cranked the crankshaft, the Tiger would have time to reload 3 times. "Don't breathe," Smirnov ordered mentally. "Don't exist. Become a branch. Become mud." The Tiger's turret continued to crawl, degree by degree. There it passed the 45-degree mark. There, 60. The muzzle looked almost at us. I saw the rifling in the bore. I saw paint chips on the gun mantlet. Time stretched, turning into a viscous substance. A second weighed more than our entire self-propelled gun. The heart beat not in the chest, but somewhere in the throat, cutting off oxygen access. Gunner Volkov was in the very hell of this moment. His task was to keep the sight on the concrete support of the sluice, but with peripheral vision, he saw the turning death. Instinct screamed, "Hit first! Traverse the gun, strike it point blank, blow off this arrogant turret." But turning the ISU barrel that angle quickly is impossible. We are a self-propelled gun, not a tank. We don't have a turret. To shoot at the Tiger, we need to turn the entire hull. That takes seconds. The German has the mechanical advantage. Volkov's finger lay on the trigger of the galvanic mechanism. The skin on the phalanx turned white. He took up the slack on the trigger. Millimeters remained. One involuntary muscle contraction from terror, and the 152mm HE shell goes into the sluice. Prematurely. We destroy the dam, but the Tiger, 30 meters away, remains intact and shoots us at point-blank range while we reload. It will be a Pyrrhic victory. Or a stupid death. "Wait!" Smirnov's voice sounded inside the head, although the commander's lips didn't move. The Tiger's barrel froze. It looked straight into our bush. The black pupil of death stared into my periscope. Between us and the shell was only foliage and a camouflage net. The German commander was saying something into the throat microphone. He doubted. Does he see the silhouette of a machine? Or just a suspicious shadow? At that moment, physics played a cruel joke on us. The cooling engine of our ISU made a sound. A metallic click. Ordinary thermal contraction of metal. Click. Loud. Distinct. The German flinched. His hand reached for the hatch to close up. The Tiger's gunner clearly received the command, "Attention." The barrel swayed slightly downward, groping for the hull of the invisible enemy. This was the end. The bifurcation point was passed. We were detected. Now a flash, an impact, and darkness would follow. I felt cold sweat flowing down my back in a trickle, like an icy worm. Life compressed to the size of a pinhead. We were walled up in a steel crypt, awaiting execution. Volkov whimpered. Quietly, on one note. It was the sound of an animal cornered. His finger trembled on the trigger. Smirnov placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. Didn't hit, didn't squeeze, just placed it. The weight of the commander's hand grounded the panic. This gesture meant, I am here. I control the chaos. Until I give the command, you do not die. The German commander looked at the tracks again. Then he shifted his gaze to the column,
which continued to pull onto the corduroy road.
Trucks honked from behind. Traffic jam.
War is a schedule. Stopping the lead vehicle breaks the logistics of the entire division. The officer hesitated. Check the bushes with a machine gun burst? Or not waste time on phantoms? Seconds dripped like molten lead. 1, 2, 3. The Tiger's turret stood motionless. The muzzle hypnotized us. It seemed the shell was already flying. Time had just slowed down enough for us to examine its flight. Suddenly, the Tiger's engine roared. The exhaust belched a cloud of black smoke. The commander waved his hand. Forward. The turret jerked and began slowly, reluctantly returning to travel position. The electric drive whined again, but now this sound was music. The barrel was turning away. Death, having looked us in the eye, decided we weren't interesting. Or just got lazy. Close call, exhaled Petrov, sliding down the seat. Belay relaxation. Smirnov instantly returned tone to the crew. Target, sluice. Readiness, absolute. The German missed his chance. He mistook the engineering ambush for an empty bush. A perception error. An error that would cost the lives of his entire unit. We were on a thread, but the thread didn't break. Now that the threat of a direct shot had passed, and the Tiger had turned away, exposing its rear armor plate to us, the situation flipped. The adrenaline that should have been burned in a battle with the tank now sought an exit. And there was only one exit. Through the breach of our howitzer. Straight into the concrete. All the accumulated energy of terror, all those seconds under the enemy gun, all the hatred for this mechanical monster, all this was now concentrated on the tip of Gunner Volkov's finger. Column in place, center of mass, in the kill zone. Smirnov spoke fast, like a telegraph. Volkov, do you see the reference point? Yes, sir, I see it. Forget the tank. The tank is a corpse.
Think about the water. Think about the crack.
Ready. We survived our death. We resurrected. And now we became the judges. The periscopes no longer fogged up from our fear. Hands didn't shake. Only cold, angry calculation remained. Range 200. Target stationary. Charge full. Ryabov, step back! Smirnov barked again. It's going to be loud. This moment of silence before the storm was the most terrifying. German engines roared, but for us, the world went quiet. Only one sound existed. The click of the safety. Smirnov drew air into his lungs. At the sluice. Fire! The word fire didn't sound like a scream. It escaped as an exhale, freeing the lungs from accumulated carbon dioxide. Volkov pulled the trigger. At that moment, human will ended, and the chemistry of combustion and the mechanics of expanding gases took over. The firing pin struck the primer of the casing. The igniter worked in fractions of a millisecond. 6 kilograms of powder charge turned into superheated gas, creating pressure of 2,000 atmospheres in the chamber. This pressure knew no mercy. It sought an exit and found it, pushing the 48-kilogram 530 F540 shell into the bore. The rifling bit into the copper driving band, spinning the steel slug around its longitudinal axis. The shell began its acceleration. It traveled the length of the barrel, gaining speed to 600 meters per second. This is physics in pure form. Thermal energy turned into kinetic energy, with an efficiency unattainable for civilian engines. For the crew inside the steel box, it was like a catastrophe. The ISU-152 is a heavy, inertial machine. But the recoil of the ML-20S howitzer is monstrous. 46 tons of alloy steel jumped in place like a frightened horse. The hull set back. The tracks, deeply mired in the swamp, spun, tearing roots and churning mud. The recoil mechanisms absorbed part of the energy, but what remained was enough to break an unprepared man's neck. We were thrown forward onto the instruments, then thrown back against the armor plates. The sound didn't come through the ears. Ears were instantly plugged by the vacuum shock. The sound passed through the body. It was a sledgehammer blow right to the sternum. The diaphragm compressed, knocking the wind out. Inside the casemate, a vortex of dust, scale, and fine debris that had accumulated in the cracks for years whipped up. It went dark. The dome light flickered and went out, unable to withstand the vibration. We remained in semi-darkness, deafened, disoriented, in a cloud of acrid powder smoke which, despite the fan working, began to fill the fighting compartment. The bitter taste of burnt nitroglycerin settled on the tongue. Outside, the muzzle brake acted as a splitter, venting jets of superheated gases to the sides. The shockwave wiped the camouflage off our machine like a hurricane tearing off a roof. The bushes hiding us simply disappeared, sheared off by the gas jet. The fog in front of the barrel was instantly vaporized, forming a perfectly clean tunnel in the atmosphere. A tunnel through which death flew. The flight of the shell took 0.3 seconds. The human eye is incapable of registering this movement, but Smirnov's brain, working now in slow motion mode, saw the trajectory. The shell went flat. It carried kinetic energy equal to the impact of a locomotive derailed. 48 kilograms of steel flying at twice the speed of sound know no obstacles. Air resistance for such mass is negligible. Impact. The shell smashed into the concrete pier of the sluice exactly at the point the engineering calculation marked, into the crack at the waterline. Concrete is a material strong in compression, but brittle in tension. A kinetic strike of such force doesn't just crumble the surface. It causes hydrodynamic shock inside the material itself. The crystal lattice of the cement stone collapsed instantly. The rebar inside the pier, rusted from years of inaction, didn't play the role of a frame. It acted like shrapnel, tearing the concrete from the inside. But that was only the beginning. The fuse was set to high explosive action with a delay. The shell managed to penetrate deep into the body of the dam a few dozen centimeters before the main charge triggered. Nearly 6 kilograms of explosives detonated inside the structure. The explosion inflated the concrete from the inside. It didn't look like a Hollywood fireball. It was the dry, sharp crack of a breaking monolith, amplified by the echo over the water. The support pier, holding the weight of the steel gates and thousands of cubic meters of water, ceased to exist as a load-bearing element. It turned into a cloud of rubble and dust. The structure lost equilibrium. The heavy steel shield of the sluice, losing support on one side, skewed. The upper hinge snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. A huge mass of metal crashed down, but didn't close the passage. Instead, it jammed across it, breaking the remains of the concrete. The water, which the dam had held back for years, gained freedom. The potential energy of the lake, raised above the lowland level, instantly turned into kinetic energy. This was no longer artillery. It was disaster hydraulics. A wall of water, compressed in the narrow breach, hit the remains of the structure. Pressure at the breakthrough point jumped to critical values. The water worked like a liquid battering ram. It tore out chunks of concrete weighing tons and hurled them forward like pebbles. The second pier, unable to withstand the vibration and the sharp change in the load vector, cracked at the base. The dam began to fold. The entire reclamation system, built by Soviet engineers in the 30s, turned into a weapon of mass destruction in 1 second. The crew of the ISU couldn't see the results yet. We only felt them. The earth under the tracks shuddered a second time, now not from the shot, but from the fall of thousands of tons of concrete. "Hit!" Volkov screamed, pressed to the eyepiece. Although he couldn't see anything, a cloud of dust and smoke hung before us. He screamed to convince himself he was still alive, that his eardrums hadn't burst completely. Smirnov brushed plaster off his map case that had fallen from the casemate's ceiling. He wasn't smiling. The engineering calculation was justified. The formula worked. We didn't shoot at soldiers. We shot at the load-bearing structure of the landscape. And the landscape reciprocated. Loader Ryabov, thrown against the wall by the recoil, breathed heavily, gasping for air saturated with fumes. His hands shook, but no longer from the weight of the shell, but from the adrenaline dump. The gun breech smoked, radiating heat. The casing, ejected by the extractor, clinked against the floor, spinning and scattering sparks. It was the sound of a period at the end of a sentence. Outside, on the corduroy road, hell arrived. But it wasn't the fiery hell of war. It was the cold, wet hell of the elements. The Germans, deafened by the close burst, hadn't yet realized what happened. They heard the shot, saw the flash somewhere to the side, saw the fountain of concrete shards. They thought it was a miss, that the Russians hit the sluice by mistake. The crew of the Tiger began to turn the turret back toward us, preparing to punish for the audacity. They didn't know that the earth under their tracks was already condemned, that in a second, the concept of solid surface would cease to exist for this grid square. We had no time for celebration. Smirnov knew. Phase 2 starts now.
The chaos phase. "Load!" His voice cut through the ringing in the ears. "He! Rapid fire! He up!" Ryabov was already on his feet. The pain in his back vanished. His body worked on automatic. He grabbed the next shell. We triggered a chain reaction. We woke the water. Now we had to make sure no one got out of this flow dry. One shot of 152nd caliber drowned the logic of positional warfare. From here on, only gravity and panic worked. First came the sound. It wasn't the roar of an explosion, which had already rung out and gone into the past. It was a low, womb-like roar, like the sigh of the earth itself. The sound of tearing matter. The lake, hanging over the road at a height of 3 meters, gushed into the breach. Hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of water, compressed by the banks, received a vector of motion. Water is not a soft substance. At a flow speed of 40 kilometers per hour, water acquires the properties of concrete. This is the physics of hydrodynamic impact. The flow, saturated with silt, stones, pieces of rebar, and dam debris, hit the causeway embankment like a solid body. The trucks died first. The Opels and 3-axle Mercedes stood no chance. The kinetic energy of the water ram swept them off the road like dry leaves off a table. I saw a heavy truck with ammunition tossed into the air. It flipped over the cab, scattering crates, and vanished into the brown foam. Canvas tarps tore with a crackle sounding like machine gun fire. The men sitting in the beds didn't even have time to understand what killed them. They didn't drown. They were ground up by the mass of logs and iron the wave carried. The corduroy road, built of pine trunks fastened with staples, cracked. This engineering structure held on a wing and a prayer and the surface tension of the swamp. The wave's impact destroyed this fragile bond. The logs reared up. The road under the German column ceased to be a plain and turned into a chaos of wood and water. Heavy logs torn from the decking flew through the air like projectiles, piercing the sides of APCs, maiming infantry. But the most terrible things happened to the tanks. 2 Tigers, the pride of the Panzerwaffe, were trapped by their own mass. 57 tons of weight is an advantage in a tank battle when you stand on solid ground. But here, on the shaky swamp, mass became a sentence. The causeway under them was annihilated. An abyss of liquefied soil opened up under the tracks. I looked into the periscope and saw physics killing technology. The lead Tiger lost traction. The friction coefficient of steel tracks on liquid mud is 0. The tank slid sideways, slowly, majestically, like a sinking ship. The Tiger's driver-mechanic desperately gunned the engine. The tracks spun, throwing up fountains of sludge, but this only accelerated the sinking.
Thixotropic effect of soil. The more actively you resist the quagmire, the faster it becomes liquid. The tank listed to the starboard side. The wave hit the turret, flooding the engine compartment. The Maybach engine gulped water through the air intakes. Hydrolock in the cylinders. Connecting rods bent, the engine block cracked. The machine's heart stopped instantly. 57 tons of dead metal began to slide into the ditch, which had now become the bottom of a new riverbed. The horror of what was happening wasn't in blood, but in the mechanics of inevitability. The crew inside the tank ended up in a steel coffin. When water covers the hatches, opening them from inside is impossible. The hydrostatic pressure of a water column just 1 meter high presses on the hatch cover with a force of hundreds of kilograms. A human is incapable of pressing off such weight.
The Germans inside the Tiger furiously spun the lock wheels, pushed with their shoulders, but physics was against them. They were sealed. Water began to enter through vision slits, through ventilation, through the turret ring. Cold, dirty sludge filled the fighting compartment, rising to the throat. Darkness, confinement, and icy water. This is a death you wouldn't wish on an enemy. The second tank tried to turn around. Its commander, apparently more experienced, realized what was happening and gave the order for reverse. But turning on a corduroy road is suicide. When attempting a turn, one track breaks, the other claws. The load on the soil doubles. The causeway under the left track snapped with a cannon-like roar. The tank dipped its nose and fell into a washout. Its rear reared into the sky, exposing the defenseless underbelly. The turret went underwater immediately. The long gun barrel, with which they aimed at us a minute ago, was now a useless crowbar stuck in the silt. The elements raged. It was chaos impossible to control, but which we provoked. Water washed away everything: motorcycles, the kitchen, ammo crates, people. The screams of the drowning and crushed were drowned out by the roar of the current. It was a symphony of destruction. The war of machines ended. The war of biology against geology began. And geology was winning by a landslide. "So much for the master race," Ryabov muttered, watching the water spin the body of a German officer caught by his belt on a broken log. "They swim just as badly as we do." Smirnov was silent. He was assessing the scale of destruction. The dam was completely destroyed. The lake level dropped, turning the valley into a mud flow. The road no longer existed. The logistical artery of the army group was severed. Not by aviation, not by a regiment of sappers, but by one well-placed shell. This was efficiency taken to the absolute. Costs? 48 kilograms of metal and gunpowder. Result? A destroyed company and loss of heavy equipment. But the water began to recede as quickly as it came. The main surge passed, leaving behind a battlefield resembling the junkyard of history. Mud mixed with oil, gun barrels sticking out of the swamp. APCS overturned wheels up, looking like dead beetles. Those who managed to jump out of the trucks, who survived the first impact, were now trying to get to islands of dry land. They clambered onto the remains of the embankment, dirty, wet, having lost weapons and human semblance.
This was no longer an army. It was a crowd of survivors. Panic is discipline's worst enemy. They weren't thinking about defense. They were thinking only about how to inhale air. "Mechanic," Smirnov's voice was calm, as if we were on maneuvers. "Start it up." Petrov pressed the starter button. Compressed air hissed in the tanks. The V2 engine sneezed, let out a puff of blue smoke, and confidently began hammering with 12 pistons. The ISU hull vibrated. Now this tremor was pleasant. We were alive. We were mobile. And the enemy lay in the mud. "Volkov," Smirnov continued. "See the infantry cluster on the right, on the remains of the embankment." "I see it, Comrade Commander. There's an APC stuck there too." "That one, with the antenna. That's the command vehicle." "I see it." "High explosive, center of group. Let's finish the panic." The water did the main work. It broke the spine of the German attack. It stripped them of armor and maneuverability. Now it was time for cleanup. It was dirty work, but war is not a jousting tournament. War is the destruction of enemy manpower and equipment, and if the enemy is floundering in the mud, that's his problem. Our task is to make sure he doesn't get out. Ryabov slammed the HE shell into the breach with a clang that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. The bolt closed. "Ready!" We were exiting standby mode. Now we were masters of the situation. The ISU-152, the Beast Slayer, was waking up to deliver the coup de grace, or a strike of retribution. In war, these concepts often coincide. Physics had done its job. Now the floor belonged to the chemistry of explosives. We felt no pity. Pity is a civilian emotion. We only had calculation. The more we lay down here, in this swamp, the fewer of them reach our positions. The arithmetic of survival is simple and cruel. "Fire!" commanded Smirnov. The second shot tore through the fog, which had already begun to settle. The shell went toward the swarming mass of gray-green uniforms, to where people were trying to save themselves from the water, not knowing there is no salvation from artillery. Panic is not an emotion. In combat conditions, it is an unaccounted variable that destroys any control system faster than shrapnel. What remained of the German column ceased to be a military unit of the Wehrmacht. It was a biological mass, driven by a single instinct, the instinct of self-preservation, which, in this situation, worked against them. The water gushing through the breach had done its deed. It deprived them of equipment, communications, and reason. Now artillery entered the fray to finish what was started. We weren't fighting a duel. A duel implies the existence of an opponent capable of responding. Here, it was an execution. A methodical, cold engineering process of clearing a grid square. Smirnov looked into the periscope not as a judge, but as a disinfection operator. He saw islands of dry land onto which the survivors had crawled. Dirty, wet figures in field gray huddled in bunches. This is a mistake. Herd reaction. They sought protection in a comrade's shoulder, but found only death. A group target for a howitzer of 152mm caliber is a gift of ballistics. Reference point 2. Group by the fallen pine. Range 400. Smirnov's voice was devoid of excitement. Only coordinates and facts. "I see it," Volkov responded. He wasn't trembling anymore. His hands worked with the smoothness of hydraulics. When the target cannot run and cannot shoot back, the gunner turns into a god. An angry god of precision. Ryabov shoved the shell into the breach. His movements became automatic, jerky. The fatigue accumulated in his muscles passed into a phase of dull indifference.
He was simply moving 48 kilograms of death from the rack to the barrel. The clang of the bolt sounded like the click of a guillotine. "HE, fuse set to O," he reported, setting the fuse to fragmentation action. This means the shell will burst instantly upon touching the ground, without digging in. All the energy of the explosion and 6,000 fragments will fan out over the surface, creating a zone of continuous destruction. "Fire!" Shot. The ISU jerked again, spitting a tongue of flame. The shell went on a flat trajectory. Fractions of a second later, where the soldiers of the shattered regiment pressed against each other, a black tulip of explosion grew. Earth, water, and metal flew up in a dirty fountain. The shockwave passed over the water like a ripple, knocking those still standing off their feet. 152nd caliber is excessive power for infantry. It's like hitting ants with a sledgehammer. Upon the burst of a 530 F540 shell, a crater 3 meters in diameter and 1.5 meters deep is formed. The radius of continuous destruction by shrapnel is 70 meters. Lethal force is maintained at a distance of up to 300 meters. Those at the epicenter simply vanished, turning into aerosol. Those nearby fell, cut down by steel rain. We didn't hear screams. Thick armor and the roar of our own engine reliably isolated us from the acoustics of human suffering. We saw only the result. Figures fell like bowling pins. Someone tried to crawl, dragging their legs, but the viscous mud wouldn't let go. "Shift fire, right 003, Smirnov corrected. "See the truck? They're trying to traverse the AA gun." "I see it. Rough aim." "Hit it!" The Germans, preserving remnants of discipline, tried to organize resistance. The crew of a quad 20mm anti-aircraft mount on a half-track tractor feverishly spun hand wheels. They were looking for us. They saw flashes in the bushes. It was agony. 20mm against the front armor of an ISU is peas against a wall. But Smirnov didn't intend to give them a chance to even scratch the paint. Ryabov, breathing heavily, handed the third shell. Sweat poured into his eyes. His tunic stuck to his back in a dark patch. The ammo rack was empty. These were the last arguments in the dispute. "Ready! Fire!" The shell hit just below the side of the tractor, into the water. This was even worse than a direct hit. Water, an incompressible medium, transmitted the explosion energy in all directions. The heavy machine weighing 8 tons was tossed and flipped in the air. The anti-aircraft mount was torn from the ring. The explosion of the ammo load, boxes of small caliber shells, added fire to this picture. Fireworks in the middle of the swamp. Yellow and red tracers flew in all directions, indiscriminately stinging their own. A heavy smell of burnt gunpowder stood in the casemate. The fan buzzed strainedly, failing to cope with the smoke. Eyes watered, throats tickled, but the crew worked precisely, like a clock. "Two left," Ryabov stated. He looked at the empty nesting slots of the rack. "Finishing them," Smirnov said harshly. "Over there, by the edge of the forest. I see officers. They're trying to gather men. Don't let them leave." It was the math of war. If we let them go now, they will regroup. They will report our position. They will call in aviation. Every surviving German is a potential threat to our tanks coming behind us somewhere 20 kilometers east. We had to zero out this threat here and now. The fourth shot landed long, mowing down the brush behind the backs of the fleeing men. Shrapnel hit backs. Panic intensified. Men abandoned the wounded, abandoned weapons, threw themselves into the water trying to swim across the spilled lake. But swimming in greatcoats and boots is a suicide mission. The water dragged them to the bottom more effectively than any whirlpool. "Last one!" Ryabov shouted. He lifted the shell like a sacred relic. It was the final chord. 48 kilograms that would put a period in the history of this battle.
Smirnov looked for a worthy target. Shooting at individuals is wasteful. He looked for the center of mass, and found it. The remains of the column huddled on a rise where a shed used to stand. Now only walls remained of the shed, but they gave an illusion of cover. About 50 men packed in there. They thought walls would save them. They didn't know that 152 millimeters doesn't notice brickwork 1.5 bricks thick. "Into the structure, below the foundation line, HE," commanded Smirnov. "Structure acquired," Volkov responded. He aimed the crosshairs at the dark opening where shadows flickered. "Goodbye," whispered Petrov, looking into his observation device. Shot. The casing flew onto the floor with a ring. The shell smashed into the base of the wall. The explosion blew the old building to dust. The roof collapsed, burying those who sought salvation beneath it. A cloud of brick dust and black smoke covered the hill. Nothing moved there anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. The roar of engines died down. Screams fell silent. Only the noise of water and the ringing in the ears. We expended the ammo load. 5 shells. 5 heartbeats of this steel machine. Result? Destroyed dam, flooded equipment, scattered and partially destroyed enemy company. We did our job. Without heroic shouts of "Ura!" Without flags over the Reichstag. Just dirty, heavy work of disposing of enemy force. "Cease fire!" Smirnov leaned back against the seat backrest. He took out a cigarette case. His hands shook slightly, but it was the tremor of tension release, not fear. "Petrov, kill it. Let's listen." The diesel went quiet. And again the silence of the Belarusian swamp descended upon us. But now this silence was different. It was the silence of a graveyard. In the fog, which began to slowly disperse, the outlines of what we had done emerged. Gun barrels sticking out of the water resembled grave crosses. The torn-up earth smoked. The smell of burning overpowered the smell of swamp muck. We sat inside the cooling self-propelled gun, deafened, tired, empty. We were alive, and that was the only result that mattered at the moment. Engineer Smirnov looked at his hands. They were black with soot. The hands of a creator, which today became an instrument of absolute destruction. But he felt no guilt. He felt only metal fatigue and the heaviness of duty done. The fog, which had been our ally and curse for the last 2 hours, finally capitulated to the laws of thermodynamics. The sun, breaking through the low cloud cover, began to evaporate the moisture, lifting it in white pillars to the sky. A panorama opened before our eyes worthy of the brush of a mad surrealist painting with crude oil on mud. It wasn't a battlefield in the usual sense. It was the site of a man-made disaster provoked by a single engineering decision. The silence that fell on the swamp was heavier than the roar. It was a dead, viscous silence, broken only by the splash of water flowing into new channels and the rare clicks of cooling metal. The German column ceased to exist as an organized force. On the site of the corduroy road, where Maybach engines had recently growled and tracks clanked, now stretched a dirty mess of logs, silt, and twisted iron. 2 heavy Tiger tanks, the pride of the Third Reich, lay on their sides, half submerged in the quagmire. They resembled dead whales washed ashore by a storm. Their formidable guns, 88mm caliber, helplessly poked into the sludge. Water washed away not only their camouflage, but also the aura of invincibility, turning them into piles of expensive scrap metal weighing 57 tons each. Open hatches loomed black like empty eye sockets.
The crews either fled or remained inside, becoming part of the underwater world of the Belarusian swamps. Trucks and APCs were scattered chaotically, like toys thrown by a capricious child. Inverted chassis, torn-off wheels, ripped open sides. The water gushing from the breached sluice worked like a hydraulic press, twisting frames and tearing off turrets. It was the triumph of formless elements over the strict geometry of German order. The hatch of the commander's cupola of the ISU-152 opened with a heavy metallic sigh. Fresh air, smelling of dampness and muck, burst into the casemate, mixing with the acrid burning of powder gases and the smell of sweaty bodies. We climbed out slowly, like miners after a shift in the face. Legs were numb, a continuous ringing stood in the ears, the consequence of concussion from our own firing. Faces were black with soot, eyes red from strain. Smirnov climbed onto the armor first. He didn't climb down to the ground. He sat on the edge of the casemate, legs in heavy tarpaulin boots dangling, and took out a papyrosa cigarette. His hands, stained with grease, finally stopped shaking. He struck a match. The flame flared brightly, flashing against the background of gray steel. The commander took a deep drag, blowing a stream of smoke into the clear sky. He didn't look at the corpses. He didn't look at the disabled tanks. His gaze was riveted to the destroyed sluice. There, 200 meters from us, a gap yawned. The concrete piers were sheared off at the root. Rebar stuck out in all directions like the nerves of a pulled tooth. Smirnov assessed the quality of the destruction. As an engineer, he saw not just a crater, but a point of force application. The calculation proved correct. One shell, fired into a vulnerable node of the structure, released the energy of 1,000,000 cubic meters of water. The efficiency coefficient of this shot tended toward infinity. We, the rest of the crew, climbed out after him. Ryabov, mechanic Petrov, gunner Volkov. We stood on the armor of our machine, looking at the work of our hands. No one smiled. No one shouted, "Ura!" Inside was empty. The adrenaline burned out, leaving behind only leaden fatigue and dull indifference. We survived. This was the only emotion we had strength for. We just stood and breathed, feeling the wind dry our sweat-soaked tunics. 10 minutes later, noise was heard from the forest. But it wasn't the alarming drone of German engines. It was the dear, familiar rumble of V2 diesels and curt commands in Russian. Our infantry. Vanguard reconnaissance. They came out of the bushes cautiously, weapons at the ready. Soldiers in faded tunics, with PPSS submachine guns on their chests. They expected a battle, an ambush, resistance. But they saw only a graveyard of equipment. They stopped, stunned by the scale of destruction. The young lieutenant commanding the platoon lowered his binoculars. He looked at the flooded tigers, at the torn-up causeway, at the enemy corpses floating in the water. Then he shifted his gaze to the lone self-propelled gun standing in the bushes. The ISU-152 looked like a prehistoric monster resting after a hunt. Mud on the sides dried into a crust. The gun barrel, still warm, looked toward the ruins of the sluice. 5 men, black with soot, sat on the armor. The lieutenant walked closer, slapping his boots through the liquid mud. He looked at Smirnov with undisguised respect and, it seems, with fear. To the infantry, what happened here looked like a miracle, like divine intervention. They didn't see formulas. They saw the result. "Comrade Captain," the lieutenant stumbled, seeing Smirnov's shoulder boards. Did you do this to them? Alone?" Smirnov slowly turned his head. He flicked the ash from his cigarette onto the armor. There was no heroism in his gaze.
There was the fatigue of a man who just finished a hard shift at the factory. "We did," he answered shortly. "Engineering barrier. Dismantling completed successfully." "But there's a whole company there!" "Tanks." The lieutenant waved his hand at the panorama of death. "What did you hit them with? Covered them with a battalion? Aviation?" "With 5 shells." Smirnov extinguished the butt on the armor plate and flicked it into the swamp. "And the laws of physics, Lieutenant." "Hydrodynamics is a terrible force if you know where to press." The infantry soldiers wandered among the disabled equipment, collecting trophies. They looked at our machine like an icon. For them, war was a bayonet charge, the mud of trenches, and a stray bullet. For us, war today became an equation. We solved it. We proved the theorem that intellect combined with a caliber of 152 millimeters is capable of stopping an avalanche of steel. Smirnov stood up. He patted the breech of the gun protruding from the casemate with his palm. It was a gesture of gratitude, not to a machine, but to a tool. "Petrov, check the running gear. We need to move out. 0 fuel, we'll wait for a tanker or a tow." "Check running gear, roger," the mechanic responded, already opening the transmission hatch. Life was returning to its usual course. Heroism ended, routine began. Maintenance, refueling, replenishing ammo. Tomorrow there will be a new battle, new tasks, new concrete walls and new German tanks. But this battle will remain in textbooks, if someone guesses to write it down. Not as an example of courage, but as an example of cold calculation. This is the essence of an engineer's war. You don't run screaming at machine guns. You look at the map, evaluate elevation changes, calculate material strength, and find the point where a strike will collapse the enemy's system. Today that point was an old concrete sluice. Tomorrow it might be a bridge support, a building foundation, or a fuel depot. We sat on the armor, watching the sun finally disperse the fog. The wet steel of dead machines glistened. Craters loomed black. And Smirnov was already taking out the map. He wasn't living in the past battle. He was already looking for the next position. Because war is work. Heavy, dirty, bloody work of the mind and mechanisms. And as long as we have shells and a head on our shoulders, we will perform this work. One shot, one catastrophe. Efficiency with which it is impossible to argue.